From Worth Farm to Center City Garden, the evolution of the lawn of Asheboro, North Carolina. On January 30th, 1888, young Sidney Swaim Robbins and his brother Henry were awakened deep in the night by their parents, Marmaduke and Annie Robbins. The family lived in Asheboro, North Carolina, on the east side of present-day Main Street, at what is now the intersection with Marmaduke Circle. Here's how Sidney recounted the experience. I was called up and led to the north and east corner windows, where there was to behold a great light and bustle diagonally across the corner. The old Jonathan Worth homestead was burning down to the ground. I think there was something like a bucket brigade at work trying to save either a piece of the house or else the John Hill house directly across. Something was said for Henry's benefit and mine about the children being glad to be able to report in after years of having witnessed the occurrence, for our elders felt that it was a historic moment and that a landmark was going down. Jonathan Worth was Asheboro's leading citizen before the Civil War and served as governor of North Carolina after the war, the only person from Randolph County to hold that office. His house sat on a farm of about 12 acres in what was becoming the center of Asheboro, in a block bounded today by Worth, Main, Academy, and Cox streets. It's a fitting coincidence that the house burned when it did, because it was only 2 years earlier that the farm left the Worth family to be subdivided into town lots. As it turned out, the farm remained largely undeveloped for decades and became legendary for the three-hole golf course created in the center of the block by Acme McCrary Hosiery Mills founder D.B. McCrary, after McCrary had acquired the lots fronting Worth Street. A tract of the old Worth farm, comprising the McCrary golf course and approaches to it off Cox Street, has been selected as the site of the David and Pauline Gerald Center City Garden, an arboretum for the people of Asheboro. It would be an appropriate choice if its associations with Worth and McCrary were the only two factors that make the space noteworthy. But research into the property shows that it is even more representative of Asheboro's history, especially in terms of the city's economic development, than people nowadays may be aware. It also seems that the space has long had a significance in local memory, as with the Robbins family's recognition that a landmark was going down when the Worth house burned. Here's part of a 1924 deed recording the sale of a lot on the southeast corner of the block. It references the overall Worth farm property as the Bradshaw lands after George Samuel Bradshaw, the local attorney who bought it from the Worth family. More about him shortly. Notably, the deed describes the area as the lawn of Asheboro NC. This is not a familiar reference to those knowledgeable about Asheboro history, but it does indicate that as late as 1924, local people accorded the old Worth farm a certain status. What did lawn of Asheboro mean? Was it a de facto park before the era of modern parks and recreation? Was it a gathering place or picnic ground? We don't know, but the implication is that the space retained a special importance. So let's take a look at the evolution of the Worth farm from the time of Jonathan Worth to the present, particularly in terms of those who have owned all or a portion of it. It becomes evident that the Center City Garden has a family tree of sorts, starting with Jonathan Worth, but also involving two other early and influential Randolph County families, the Walkers and the Moffats, whose names keep popping up in relation to this property through the decades. Jesse Walker was the patriarch of a prominent family living near present-day Randleman. He was an important investor in cotton mills along the Deep River. In 1848, he established the Union Factory, which became the Randleman Manufacturing Company. In 1828, he and Jonathan Worth were among several partners in an effort to start the county's first cotton mill at Cedar Falls. The initiative did not come to fruition, but it was the first instance of what you might call venture capital in Randolph County, in which a group of investors pooled their resources and sold stock to create an enterprise where none existed before. The Cedar Falls Manufacturing Company would be launched in 1836 by another group of partners, but later would come to involve both Worth and Walker. Hugh Moffat's parents immigrated from Ireland and settled in what would become southeastern Randolph County. Hugh Moffat established Moffat's Mill, a successful grist milling operation near Buffalo Ford on the Deep River between present-day Ramseur and Coleridge. One of his sons, Eli Needham Moffat, would become a partner with Jonathan Worth and Jesse Walker in a reorganization of the Cedar Falls factory in 1858. But the story of the Center City Garden starts with Jonathan Worth. Worth was born in 1802 in the community of Center in south-central Guilford County near the Randolph County line to David and Eunice Worth. This is David Worth. The family lived on a prosperous farm and were members of Center Friends Meeting. The Worths traced their origin to Quakers from Nantucket, Massachusetts, who migrated south. During Jonathan Worth's political career, he sometimes was referred to by his opponents as that Nantucket Quaker. Worth studied law in Hillsboro under Archibald DeBow Murphy. That's not a household name, but Murphy has been called North Carolina's greatest citizen ever. He was a man ahead of his time when the state was definitely behind the times. You may recall from history classes in school that we were known as the Rip Van Winkle state in the early to mid-1800s due to our steadfast refusal to develop our resources. Murphy was an advocate for economic development, then called internal improvements. As a state senator, he envisioned and advocated for a system of public education which was mandated in the state's Constitution of 1776, but not implemented. His pleas fell on deaf ears in his time, but his ideas are at the core of our public education system today, which Jonathan Worth would help implement. Worth was heavily influenced by Murphy's ideas and became his protege. He also married Murphy's niece, Martisha Daniel. In 1824, Worth and Martisha bought a small lot west of the courthouse square in Asheboro. In 1826, they acquired the 12-acre tract that would become known as the Worth Farm, and in 1830 built their house. They started a family. Jonathan and Martisha would have 6 daughters and 1 son to survive to adulthood, and Worth settled into the life of a gentleman farmer, attorney, and businessman. Let's change directions for a moment and take a quick look at how Asheboro came into being and what it looked like in the years before the Civil War. As North Carolina's population grew ever westward throughout the 1700s, big counties were further subdivided into smaller ones. By 1771, what we now think of as Randolph County was part of Guilford County, which extended from our current southern border to the Virginia state line. People in the southern part of Guilford County lobbied for local government closer to home, and in 1779, the legislature carved Randolph County out of Guilford. The county seat was placed where 3 important roads converged and named Johnstonville after Samuel Johnston, governor of North Carolina at the time. Almost immediately, citizens in the southern part of the county began agitating for a more centrally located county seat. In 1793, local officials acquired 200 acres right in the middle of the county for the new seat of government and situated the courthouse at nearly the dead center of the county. The new county seat was chartered on Christmas Day in 1796 and named Asheboro after Samuel Ashe, the sitting governor. The courthouse was located at the present-day intersection of East Salisbury and North Main Streets. In its first decades, Asheboro was mainly a courthouse town that came to life quarterly when the county and superior courts met. Businesses developed and offices opened to support court functions. Attorneys, stores, hotels, livery stables, blacksmiths, taverns. There was a saddlery, and newspapers were published on and off throughout the years. By the 1840s and 1850s, Asheboro was becoming a bit more prosperous. The cotton textile industry was taking root along the Deep River. The gold mining industry, which was thriving in south central North Carolina, found Asheboro an agreeable place as a center for trade and labor. Because miners came to town and hung around looking for work, Asheboro was a bit rough and tumble. There was even a notorious murder in the Hoover Hotel on the courthouse square as a result of a fight between two drunk miners. Let's take a look at Asheboro on the map in the 1850s. Here you can see our modern street network. Here's what it looked like in the mid-1850s. This map does not show all the residences and businesses, but does identify some key places. There was a population of about 150. The town mainly consisted of the courthouse square with its associated offices and businesses, surrounded by the farms of well-to-do landowners. Jonathan Worth, his brother, Dr. John Milton Worth, Benjamin Elliott and Alfred Henry Marsh, who were local businessmen and founders of the Cedar Falls Manufacturing Company, and others. The Methodist Church was established in 1834 and the Presbyterian Church in 1850. The Asheboro Female Academy, a private school, opened in 1839 and its counterpart Male Academy in 1842. Jonathan Worth was instrumental in the establishment of both of those schools. One of the major byways was the Fayetteville and Western Plank Road. Today we think of Greensboro as our primary urban partner, but until the railroad arrived in 1889, it was Fayetteville. This was because the Cape Fear River is navigable to that point. Goods arrived at the port of Wilmington, made their way by water to Fayetteville, and then inland by road, and in turn, products were exported from the interior through Fayetteville and Wilmington. The Fayetteville-Salem Road was a major artery, roughly the route today of U.S. Highway 2427 from Fayetteville to NC 705 through Robbins and Seagrove, to US 220 through Asheboro, to US 311 between Randleman and Winston-Salem. In the 1850s, the Fayetteville Road was famously paved with planks to make travel by stagecoach and wagon easier. The five Worth brothers would stretch themselves out along the route from Asheboro to Wilmington to secure their economic interests, and Jonathan Worth's son, David, would become prosperous in Wilmington. Asheboro grew modestly through the 19th century, but the town did not change much. As late as 1880, the population numbered only about 180. More rapid growth did not begin until the railroad arrived in 1889. Prior to that, and especially prior to the Civil War, the paradigm was one of limited civic development, but enterprising citizens building their own prosperity. That was the case with Jonathan Worth. Now settled on his farm in Asheboro, he practiced law and had a steady gig as clerk and master of equity in the Randolph County Court, a position that dealt with property transactions. He had expansive business interests beyond the family farm. In partnership with his brother, Joseph Addison Worth, he opened a store on the courthouse square, which was operated by employees. And he bought and sold property in Randolph County. One of his main income-producing enterprises was a turpentine operation in the Sandhills. Turpentine, as a naval store, was a major commodity in North Carolina during the 1800s. And he had a sizable agricultural operation in Moore County. He was an investor in the cotton mills along the Deep River and became president of the Cedar Falls factory in 1859, serving until his death 10 years later. He also had gold mining interests. Worth was all about business and providing a good life for his family. Simeon Colton, Asheboro's schoolmaster and Presbyterian minister, in his diary dinged Worth for working on the Sabbath and putting business ahead of religion. Like many men of his class, Worth was active in politics and found a home in the Whig Party. The Whigs advocated for the government to have a more interventionist role in the economy and believed in a stronger federal government. They were Unionists as secession became an issue, and the party was where the abolitionists gravitated. although, as Worth himself would prove, unionism and abolitionism were not always synonymous. In North Carolina, the party supported internal improvements, roads, bridges, and railroads, and especially education. It was a natural affiliation for Worth, whose Quaker background and association with Archibald Murphy made him a staunch supporter of both public and private schools, and who, as a businessman, saw that improvement of the state's infrastructure could only enhance his economic interests. Worth served in the legislature in the early 1830s, again from 1839 to 1841, and in 1858. In 1839, legislation was passed that authorized a statewide public school system. But it was vague and unhelpful, so in 1841, Worth wrote the law that implemented the previous legislation. The organization of the school system he devised harked back to Murphy's conception and is echoed today in the division of labor between the state and local governments, in which the state supports teacher salaries while the local government provides for school buildings. Back in Randolph County, Worth served as one of 26 superintendents overseeing the Randolph County Common or public schools. Worth's involvement in politics continued into the Civil War and after. Although he believed strongly that North Carolina should have remained in the Union, loyalty to the state led him to accept the position of state treasurer in the Confederate government of Governor Zebulon Vance. During Worth's tenure, he had sympathy for the peace movement that opposed the Confederates. His Unionist credentials enabled him to be elected governor immediately after the war, but he was too moderate, indeed too conservative, for the aims of Reconstruction. He had a difficult term in office, and his service ended in 1868 when the new state constitution was adopted. Worth left politics, fell ill, and died in 1869. When Worth moved permanently to Raleigh in 1862 to become state treasurer, he placed his farm and other properties on the market. He described the farm as having several contiguous lots totaling about 10 acres, an orchard of more than 200 trees, including apple, peach, pear, cherry, and other fruit trees, and 3 acres of highly fertilized, productive meadow. He describes the house as follows. The dwelling is 62 by 20 feet, with a wing 18 by 26 feet, both 2 stories high. The rooms of the main building are all plain, hard finish style, 4 of them spacious with good fireplaces, 1 a dormitory without a fireplace, and 1 a library room, fitted up with movable shelves, etc. The wing has 2 rooms with fireplaces, a dining room, and 1 room without a fireplace, with fixed wardrobes and a spacious dry cellar under the building. Worth also lists the outbuildings: a kitchen, a large smokehouse, a carriage house, 2 offices with 2 rooms and 1 fireplace each, a framed barn with stables for 8 horses, space for 600 bushels of wheat and 600 bushels of grain, and a basement to shelter cattle, a stone milk house supplied with a constant stream of cool spring water, and 3 houses for enslaved people, each with 2 rooms, 4 of the rooms with fireplaces, and 1 with a stove. At the mention of quarters for enslaved people, we have to pause and talk about the impact and pervasive nature of enslavement, even in a unionist and abolitionist bastion like Randolph County. In the agricultural economy of the era, enslavement was the only available system of labor because it was such a cheap system of labor. Enslavement was responsible for all significant prosperity in the South until industrialization. There was no profitable alternative. Some businessmen, like Worth, didn't like it, but participated in it nonetheless. And we can't forget that the labor of enslaved people gave Worth and his class of emerging entrepreneurs the capital to invest in their business ventures, particularly their textile enterprises, their leisure to engage in civic and political activities, and their capability to provide a high standard of living for their families and a quality education for their children. Worth's ownership of enslaved people tracked his growing prosperity. In 1830, he enslaved one person. In 1850, he enslaved 10 people, and by 1860, he enslaved 14 people. It's documented that Worth was more humane than many, if not most, people in his position, as far as that goes when you own a human being. He taught his enslaved people to read, which was against the law. He allowed them a degree of autonomy, and he took care of them when they became aged or infirm. Nonetheless, he viewed enslaved people as business assets, buying and selling them as he felt it necessary, although he showed loyalty to longtime servants and was careful not to separate families. He was not enlightened on matters of race, even for the era. He held a paternalistic view of people of color and did not consider them the equal of white people. As governor at the beginning of Reconstruction, he supported legislative efforts to defund the state school system he helped to create so that public schools would not be required to educate children of color alongside white children. It's important to note that in planning the Center City Garden, the organizing committee at its first meeting acknowledged Worth's ownership of enslaved people on his farm and identified the need in developing the Arboretum to mark and memorialize their presence and their contribution to Worth's success and achievement. When Worth moved to Raleigh, his farm was still largely intact, although he had sold 2 small lots over time. The first was the corner lot at the intersection of present-day Worth and Main Streets. In 1828, Worth made this lot available to George Mendenhall, an attorney from Greensboro who practiced in Asheboro, for Mendenhall to establish a law office. When Mendenhall died in 1860, Worth reacquired the property. The second lot went in 1848 to Thomas McGee Moore. Prior to the Civil War, Moore was Asheboro's unofficial mayor in an era before that office existed. And when it was established in 1869, he served until 1877 as Asheboro's first official mayor. An astute student at the Asheboro Male Academy observed in verse, "Colonel Moore is the mayor of our town. He keeps things in order by walking around." After Moore's death, his home place came back into possession of the Worth family. In 1864, Worth, now permanently relocated to Raleigh, finally sold his farm. It went to Samuel Spencer Jackson. Sam Jackson grew up in a prominent family in Pittsboro, North Carolina. He studied at the University of North Carolina, and after a brief stint as a teacher, he took up the law. In 1856, he moved to Asheboro to become Jonathan Worth's law partner. He also became Worth's son-in-law when he married Worth's daughter, Elvira Evelina. In fact, 3 Jackson brothers married 3 Worth daughters. When Worth departed for Raleigh, Jackson took over his role as clerk and master of equity and became a respected local attorney. Sam and Elvira resided in the Worth home place. They had one son, Herbert Worth Jackson, and by all accounts lived a prosperous life. In 1875, Sam Jackson passed away, apparently of a stroke. 2 years later, in 1877, Elvira married Samuel Walker. Walker was the son of Jonathan Worth's old business partner, Jesse Walker, and a longtime family friend. He had served as superintendent of the Cedar Falls factory. It was his second marriage, too. His wife, Mary Jane, had passed away earlier that year. 4 months after his wedding to Elvira, Walker died of typhoid fever, leaving Elvira to raise his children from his first marriage. In 1880, Elvira was married for a 3rd time to Eli Needham Moffett. Moffett was the son of Hugh Moffett of Moffat's Mill. He was a prominent farmer in Moore County and had been involved with Jonathan Worth in the Cedar Falls Manufacturing Company. He also was an investor in other textile operations around the state. Moffett and Elvira resided at Moffat's home place in Moore County. In 1886, Moffett died, also apparently of a stroke. Now we can add to our family tree to show how the Worths, Walkers, and Moffats began to be connected not just by business interests, but also by marriage. Elvira was a formidable woman. She was educated at the Asheboro Female Academy, which her father had helped found, and at the Edgeworth Female Seminary in Greensboro. After Eli Moffat's death in 1886, she went to live with her son Herbert Worth Jackson, now a banker in Raleigh. She moved to Richmond in 1909 with the family when Herbert was appointed as president of a bank there. Throughout her adult life, Elvira was active in civic and patriotic causes and was a leader in historical remembrance and preservation efforts. She worked to support the troops during the Spanish-American War and World War I. Her nephew, Worth Bagley, was the first American officer and the only American naval officer killed in action during the Spanish-American War. Elvira served as state regent for the Daughters of the American Revolution and was appointed honorary state regent for life as a result of her service. She also was honorary president for life of her chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy and a charter member of the North Carolina Confederate Monument Society. If you're concerned about the Confederate monument in Randolph County, you have Elvira to thank or blame. She was the prime mover in its establishment. In Raleigh, she was founder of the Stanhope Pullen Memorial Association, which supports North Carolina State University. She got the Ladies of the Edenton Tea Party plaque installed in the state capitol and was a member of the Roanoke Colony Memorial Society. In Richmond, she was responsible for the Matthew Fontaine Maury Memorial on Monument Row. Maury was a scientist and was the country's first oceanographer and became a Confederate diplomat. The monument was removed in 2020 as part of Richmond's reckoning with its Confederate past. Although living in Raleigh and later Richmond, Elvira maintained an interest in her hometown. In 1915, she wrote a history of education in Asheboro, including a first-hand account of her experiences in the 1850s at the Asheboro Female Academy. In the 1920s, she peppered the newspaper with letters to the editor advocating for the establishment of a public library to memorialize Randolph County's World War I soldiers. In 1886, while preparing to leave for Raleigh, Elvira sold the Worth farm to George Samuel Sam Bradshaw. Sam Bradshaw's family was from Guilford County, but settled in Trinity in the northwestern part of Randolph County. Sam graduated from Trinity College, which in 1892 would be moved to Durham to become Duke University. Bradshaw came to Asheboro in the 1870s to practice law. His law partner was Albion Tourget. Tourget was a larger-than-life figure. He was from Ohio and came to North Carolina after the Civil War to advocate for Reconstruction efforts and, in particular, to defend the newly granted rights of African Americans. To some North Carolinians, he was the dictionary definition of a carpetbagger. He served as a judge in Randolph County's judicial district, then practiced law in Greensboro. In the early 1880s, Sam Bradshaw became editor of Asheboro's newspaper, The Courier. He served as clerk of Superior Court from 1882 to 1894. He also had many property interests in the county and was something of a real estate developer. In this role, his intent was to subdivide the Worth farm and sell off the lots. And that's what he did. Here we see the Bradshaw plat of the Worth property. At the time the plat was recorded in the Randolph County deed book, 2 lots on the northwest corner had been sold, and the remainder of the block was broken up into lots numbered 1 through 11. The first lot went to John Thomas Moffett in 1889. We've heard the name Moffett before, but more about him in a moment because he and his family are part of a larger story. The next lot, the one on the corner of present-day Worth and Cox Streets, was sold to Parsons Harris Morris, P.H. Morris, in 1890. Morris was an early investor in Asheboro's furniture industry, but he primarily was a merchant. That same year, he and a business partner, A.C. McAllister, established a store on the courthouse square. The store survives today as the center building of this familiar block and is the earliest surviving brick commercial building in Asheboro. By the mid-1890s, Asheboro's business district had moved westward away from the courthouse square on account of the path that the railroad took through town in 1889. Around 1895, Morris built another brick store at the intersection of the Fayetteville Road and Depot Street, now the corner of Fayetteville Street and Sunset Avenue. His building still stands and is a downtown Asheboro icon. On his newly acquired lot in 1890, P.H. Morris built his house. According to a newspaper account at the time the house was torn down in 1935, in its era, it was the most modern house in Asheboro. This picture is from a postcard printed in 1979 to promote the Randolph County History book published that year. The original photograph does not appear to be around anymore. It wasn't until I enlarged the photo for this presentation that I noticed there's a figure in the foreground. The next lot sold on Bradshaw's plat went in 1893 to Annie and Eugene Grandison, E.G. Morris. Eugene Morris was the son of P.H. Morris and ran a livery stable business in town. He was said to have owned the first rubber-tired buggy in Randolph County. This is a picture from 1914 with Morris on the left and W.D. Stedman on the right. Morris is also said to have owned the first automobile in the county. The property actually was in his wife Annie's name first because her father had guaranteed the loan. At some point in the next few years, Eugene and Annie built their house. At this point, let's go back to the first lot purchased from Bradshaw by John Moffett. Moffett was the great-grandson of Hugh Moffett of Moffat's Mill. By the early 1890s, he was operator of Asheboro Wood and Iron Works. Note in this 1894 ad all that Asheboro Wood and Iron Works does. Lumber and woodwork like sashes, doors, blinds, and moldings. It's a foundry and a machine shop, and it outfits steam-driven factory operations. In other words, it has taken on at an industrial scale a lot of the work that artisans previously provided, as well as the manufacture of technology like steam that was beginning to power the cotton mills along the Deep River. While the company no doubt traded with individuals, it primarily was a business-to-business concern, supporting emerging industries such as furniture, textiles, and construction. This all became possible after the arrival of the railroad in 1889, and Asheboro Wood and Iron Works was located on the railroad tracks along what's now West Salisbury Street. After a fire in 1900, Moffett and his family reinvented the operation as Asheboro Wheelbarrow Company. Today, production of wheelbarrows might not seem a significant economic activity, but the Asheboro Wheelbarrow Company was the only wheelbarrow manufacturer in North Carolina and one of only 3 in the South. Prior to mechanization of workplaces, consider the number of wheelbarrows you would find on construction sites that came along with industrialization and road paving projects that accompanied the advent of the automobile. This would have been a profitable, high-demand operation. John Moffat was the son of Eli Abijah Beej Moffat. Beej Moffat was the popular sheriff of Randolph County from 1880 to 1888. He also was a founding trustee in 1889 of Elon College. After serving as sheriff, he established the first brick store on the courthouse square. P.H. Morris's store is the oldest brick store still remaining, but Moffat's was the first. When the store burned in 1896, Beej returned to law enforcement as a deputy collector for the United States Treasury Department, or as commonly known, a revenue agent. On December 4, 1896, he was shot dead in New London in Stanley County while serving a warrant on a bootlegger. The initial story was that Beej and the bootlegger fired simultaneously and killed each other, but it later came to light that one of the two other deputy collectors present probably shot the bootlegger, and a false story was concocted to protect the deputy from the bootlegger's cohorts and family. Let's go back to our family tree. Beej Moffat was the grandson of Hugh Moffat and the nephew of Eli Needham Moffat, who was married to Elvira Worth. Beej had 3 sons and 3 daughters. Those who figure in the Worth farm story are shown here: John, who we've talked about, and Emmett and Elijah, who we will talk about in a moment. Beej's daughter Rowena married E.H. Morris, the brother of Eugene Morris and son of P.H. Morris. So there was a close tie between the Moffat and Morris families. This extraordinary photo recently was donated to the Randolph Room of the Randolph County Public Libraries. It was taken in December 1889 and shows what we believe to be a glee club, with Eugene Morris on the left and Elijah Moffat on the right. The figures behind the wall are Oscar Teague and W. Elmer Mead. Mead was a music teacher who came to Asheboro from Brooklyn, New York. The chapter about him in Sidney Swaim Robbins' book, Sketches of My Asheboro, 1880 to 1910, makes interesting reading. Bradshaw now has sold 3 lots on his plat and the Old Worth farm. But after 1893, there was not another transaction on the property until 5 years later. What happened? Perhaps it was the Panic of 1893, a national depression lasting 4 years. The slowdown affected the whole country and hit North Carolina particularly hard. One aspect of the crisis was a credit crunch, not unlike that of the 2008 recession. We know that Annie and Eugene Morris got into trouble with the mortgage on their property. The same thing appears to have happened to Sam Bradshaw. By the end of the panic in 1897, all 500 acres of Bradshaw's properties in Randolph County, including the remaining portion of the Worth farm, were owned by the bank, in particular, the Commercial National Bank of High Point. That may not have been as dire as it seems. Bradshaw's brother, William Gaston Bradshaw, was vice president of the bank. It's not exactly clear how the situation was resolved. William Bradshaw took ownership of the property for a while, but except for 1 lot sold by William, the seller was the bank when transactions resumed on the plat. Sam Bradshaw certainly did not become destitute. He continued to have a successful career as a respected attorney in Guilford County. He also penned several entries for Ash's Biographical History of North Carolina, including the entry for Elvira Worth Moffat. The first sale in the plat, following acquisition by the bank and W.G. Bradshaw, took place in 1898. Beej Moffat's son and John Moffat's brother, Elijah, purchased Bradshaw's lot number 1. In 1900, he bought the adjacent lot number 10. Elijah was a graduate of Elon College. He practiced law in Troy and Raleigh before returning to Asheboro when his father died to join the family business and practice law. With his brother John, P.H. Morris, and James Walker, he established Asheboro Telephone Company, the town's first telephone exchange. James Walker was the brother of Samuel Walker, who was married to Elvira Worth. Elijah Moffat's sister Rowena's husband, E.H. Morris, ran the exchange. In 1902, the town election was inadvertently held on the wrong day. When the results were invalidated, Elijah was appointed mayor. He was elected in his own right the next year and served until 1907. About 1900, he built his house on lot number 10, facing present-day Worth Street. In 1902, he sold the neighboring lot number 1 to his brother Emmett. Dr. Emmett Leonidas Moffat graduated from Trinity College with a master's degree. He earned a second master's degree from Harvard University and is believed to be the first person from Randolph County to study at Harvard. He became a professor at Elon College and in 1894 relocated to Raleigh to serve as editor of the Christian Sun, the newspaper of the Christian Church denomination, which founded Elon College. On the death of his father, he returned to Asheboro to serve as Secretary-Treasurer of Asheboro Wood and Iron Works. That position is similar to Chief Operating Officer today. With his wife Ella, in 1902, he built a house on lot number 1 and moved in early 1903. The house would become known as one of Asheboro's grandest and long has been associated with later owners, Acme McCrary Hosiery Mills founder D.B. McCrary and industrialist B.B. Walker. Indeed, it has been presumed to have been built by McCrary, but it appears that it actually was constructed for Emmett Moffat. Although, at the time of its construction, it probably was not so grand and was more of a standard residence for a well-to-do member of the community. B.B. Walker's son Bart, who grew up in the house, recalls a general understanding that D.B. McCrary added the circular balcony and tall columns. The current owner of the William Underwood house, half a block away on the corner of Worth and Main Streets, built circa 1910, was told by the Underwood family that Mr. Underwood admired the McCrary or Moffat house and wanted his house modeled on it. So at the time Underwood's house was built, the house in its early years probably looked somewhat like this. Emmett and Ella did not live in the house long. In 1905, Emmett was appointed president of Elon College. He served until 1910 when he retired due to health concerns. During his successful tenure, the college doubled in size and enrollment. After Emmett's retirement, he returned to Asheboro and worked in the insurance industry. He was appointed mayor of Asheboro in 1928 to finish out the term of the incumbent, C.C. Cranford, when Cranford was elected to the legislature. Now, astute viewers may have noticed an apparent inconsistency in one of the newspaper references about Emmett Moffat's house. We've been talking about properties reaching into the block of the Old Worth farm, but fronting present-day Worth Street, or as it's labeled in Bradshaw's plat, Depot Street. But the 1903 newspaper mention of Moffat's house says that his residence is nearing completion on Main Street. As you will recall from our initial maps, present-day Main Street crosses Worth Street and makes up the eastern boundary of the Worth farm property. But here I am telling you that Emmett Moffat's house fronts present-day Worth Street. What gives? First, let's talk about Depot Street. Here's Bradshaw's original plat with later street name notations removed. It shows only Depot Street, that's present-day Worth Street, and Cox Street running north and south on the western edge of the property. In 1889, the railroad arrived in Asheboro, but it didn't make its way through the center of town, the old courthouse square. The railroad always travels on the highest level ground, and that was 1/3 of a mile to the west. As soon as the railroad was established, the business district moved westward, away from the courthouse square. The schism became more evident when the new courthouse was built in 1909 and tried to split the difference between the old town center and the new one. Present-day Sunset Avenue, running west from Fayetteville Street, became known as Depot Street, as that was where the railroad depots were located. Here's the first page of Bradshaw's plat. The Worth Farm plat we have been looking at is actually the second page. This page shows property Bradshaw owns in the northwestern part of town along the railroad tracks in relation to Depot Street, which we now know as Sunset Avenue. The second page of the plat makes clear that Depot Street continued to the old town center, the courthouse square, along the route of what we now know as Worth Street. And the two roads connect in the same fashion they do now, Worth Street running west to Fayetteville Street, then the familiar 100-foot dogleg south along Fayetteville to Sunset. Because of its importance as the connector between the old courthouse square and the new business district, Depot Street was considered the main street. This is a deed from 1900 in which Elijah Moffett sells Annie and Eugene Morris's property back to them after bailing them out of a bad mortgage. Note how the Morris property is described as starting on the northeast corner of Elijah Moffett's lot number 10 on Depot Street, sometimes called Main Street. So researchers into Asheboro's history need to note that the main street of that era is not the main street of our era. In fact, as we see in the next part of the deed description, our present-day Main Street simply was described as the cross street between the Morris and Robbins properties. Present-day Main Street did not get its name until later, possibly around 1909, when the new courthouse was built and the courthouse square became more and more disused. Initially, it was known as Old Main Street, referencing its former importance. With that digression out of the way, let's take a look at the street front of Depot Street, or present-day Worth Street, in 1904. Looking south and from east to west, starting at present-day Main Street, Eugene and Annie Morris's house is on the corner. Elijah and Mary Moffett's house is next. Then Emmett and Ella Moffett's house, a house we don't have a picture, presumably built by John Thomas Moffett on a lot that is now changing hands like regular real estate and is at this point owned by O.L. Sapp, an attorney, and the P.H. Morris house. And now it's 1905. Emmett Moffett leaves to assume the presidency of Elon College. Let's go back to the family tree, but on the Walker side. Among the children of Jesse Walker, Jonathan Worth's old friend and business partner, were Samuel Walker, who was married to Elvira Worth, and James Edward Walker. James Walker became prominent in Asheboro. As noted earlier, he was a partner in the telephone exchange with the Moffett brothers and P.H. Morris. He served as chairman of the Randolph County Board of Commissioners for many years and was a founder of West Bend Methodist Church. James had 5 children, including son Samuel Walker and daughters Patty Walker and Allie Walker. The daughters, in 1901 and 1903 respectively, married 2 up-and-coming Asheboro business partners. Patty married Thomas Henry Redding, and Allie married Dr. Bulla, D.B. McCrary. D.B. McCrary grew up on the Back Creek farm of his parents, William and Frances McCrary. His name came from the physician who delivered him, Dr. Bulla. It wasn't a name he was entirely happy with, and he chose to go by D.B. or Doc. He studied at Trinity College and Oak Ridge Military Institute. In the early 1890s, he and T. Henry Redding opened McCrary Redding Hardware in downtown Asheboro and became prosperous. They also were instrumental in the 1904 establishment of Asheboro's first Building and Loan Association. In 1909, McCrary and Redding, with business partner and Bank of Randolph president W.J. Armfield, bought Acme Hosiery Mills, which had been established in Asheboro in 1907 by a former president of the Cedar Falls Manufacturing Company. They would parlay the factory into Acme McCrary Hosiery Mills, Asheboro's leading industry in the 20th century and a worldwide leader in the field of women's hosiery. By 1959, Acme McCrary had 1,800 workers in 5 plants across Randolph County and a payroll equivalent to $50 million today, with sales offices in Asheboro, Dallas, San Francisco, Chicago's Trade Mart, and New York City's Empire State Building. The culture of the enterprise as an employer became a hallmark of Asheboro. McCrary and his family and the corporate foundation became major charitable benefactors in Asheboro, championing the development of Randolph Hospital and the public library, among other causes. All this, however, was far off in 1905, when D.B. and Allie McCrary purchased and settled into Emmett Moffat's house when Moffat left for Elon. The Old Worth farm continued to evolve. Elijah Moffat died of Addison's disease in 1913. His wife, Mary, kept their house for 4 more years as a boarding house for teachers. In 1917, she sold it to Samuel Sam Walker, the brother of Allie Walker McCrary and nephew of his namesake Samuel Walker, who was married to Elvira Worth. Sam Walker was in the wholesale grocery business in Concord, North Carolina. He had married Lily Haywood of Mount Gilead. By 1909, he was an owner and the manager of the Asheboro Grocery Company. Other investors in the grocery included McCrary and Redding. Sam and Lily had 2 children, Samuel Haywood Walker and Bartlett Burkhead B.B. Walker. Sam apparently had health problems and may have experienced money problems as well. At age 45 in 1927, he took his own life with a pistol at the home of his wife's parents in Mount Gilead. After his death, the family fell on hard times. Lily and the children moved in with her parents and sold their Asheboro property to D.B. McCrary. McCrary had purchased Annie and Eugene Morris's house in 1921. With the acquisition of the Elijah Moffat Sam Walker house, he had consolidated the eastern half of the block with lots that extended deep into the Old Worth farm. He also set about clearing his Worth Street properties. Sometime during the 1920s, the Morris house was moved to 202 South Main Street on the west side of the street near the intersection with Elm Street. It was subdivided into apartments and has remained so to this day. In 1930, the Elijah Moffat Sam Walker house was moved through the block to 229 East Academy Street, where it stands today. A newspaper account of the move reported that as the house was navigated on the last leg of its journey up a small hill toward the new lot, the chimneys collapsed. That small misfortune aside, moving houses in the early 20th century was quite a bit more common than it is now. McCrary redrew property lines and transferred part of the former Morris lot on the corner of Worth and Main Streets to his son Charles Walker McCrary, who in 1929 built his palatial residence there. Initially, D.B. McCrary placed a flower garden between his house and his son Charles's house. In 1934, McCrary's son J. Frank McCrary received part of the lot between his father and his brother and built his own house. The Classical Revival Charles McCrary House and the Tudor Revival Frank McCrary House have become two of Asheboro's most iconic residences. By 1935, when this map was created, only vestiges of the Bradshaw Plat remained, and the street fronts had begun to look more like typical Asheboro neighborhoods. But the interior of the block was a different story. McCrary, or Acme McCrary, had interests in several lots around the perimeter. By acquiring backyards or selling the front parts of lots and keeping the back parts, McCrary had preserved the interior as a natural area. In 1930, at the same time he planted the flower garden, he placed his legendary three-hole golf course on the site. D.B. McCrary's granddaughter, Boppie McCrary Toledano, remembers the course being designed by Donald Ross, the famed golfer and golf course designer who created the Pinehurst Resort Golf Course and Asheboro's 9-hole municipal golf course. It's this area that is slated to become Asheboro's Center City Garden. By the mid-1930s, Worth Street had taken its present-day name in memory of Jonathan Worth. The street from east to west now looked like this: the Charles McCrary House, the Frank McCrary House, the D.B. McCrary House with its familiar adornments, the house presumably built by John Moffett that remained occupied by various owners until the 1950s, and the P.H. Morris House, which was torn down in 1935 to make way for a more modern residence. Whether one was ever constructed is not immediately known. In 1959, the Trollinger family acquired the properties west of D.B. McCrary and built the mid-century style headquarters for their contracting and real estate business. Thus, the street took on its current appearance. To bring our story to the present day, we must make one more trip to the family tree. Samuel Walker and his wife Lily had two sons. The younger son was Bartlett Burkhead, or B.B. Walker, in his early years, Burke. Walker was the epitome of a self-made man. When Sam Walker died, the family fell on hard times. In 6th grade, B.B. Walker began selling door to door to help make ends meet. Odd jobs put him through Davidson College. During World War II, he saw combat in the U.S. Army in France. He earned the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. After the war, he joined the Acme McCrary Corporation as Southern Sales Manager. As a sideline, in 1947, he began wholesaling shoes to rural merchants under the name B.B. Walker Shoe Company. He incorporated the company in 1952 and branched out into distribution. By 1956, his sales had reached almost $1 million. While his sales business was growing, he learned the shoe manufacturing process. He purchased a 3,200 square foot factory on U.S. Highway 64 in Asheboro and began manufacturing a single type of men's work shoe. By 1964, the factory had expanded to 175,000 square feet, its white brick red trimmed facade becoming iconic on the Asheboro business strip. The company was producing 172 varieties of footwear for all markets, from work boots for linemen to shoes for women and children. It had sales outlets in all 50 states and Puerto Rico, and boasted $9 million in annual sales, a value of roughly $84 million today. That year, Walker was one of 10 businessmen nationally to receive the American Success Story Award from the Free Enterprise Awards Association and was named North Carolina's Distinguished Salesman of the Year. He would develop his own transportation company for shipping his products and start a textile division to make shoelaces. By 1973, the B.B. Walker Company employed 1,800 workers in 6 plants, 2 in Virginia, 1 in Pennsylvania, and 2 in North Carolina, in addition to the main factory in Asheboro. The diversified enterprise was parent company to 5 subsidiaries. Walker earned a national reputation as a brilliant business leader. Newspapers and magazines applied terms to him such as ingenious novice, unorthodox, dynamo, industrial giant, and financial genius, and deemed his life a Horatio Alger type rags to riches story. He was involved in Asheboro's religious and civic life and served on the Davidson College Board of Visitors. One of the unorthodox aspects of Walker's business style was the way he raised capital for the shoe company. He encouraged employees to buy company stock in a profit-sharing arrangement, and in 1964, almost half had done so. He also speculated in commodities futures, especially in hides and leather, a staple of his business. In early 1973, Walker miscalculated. He took a short position on soybean futures, predicting that prices would fall. Instead, prices rose dramatically. He had invested with company funds, money from his financial holding company, and his personal fortune. The margin calls mounted, and by the end of February, he owed $7.6 million, a value of $50 million today. With its other obligations, the B.B. Walker Shoe Company now owed 38 banks $20 million, or $131.6 million today. Walker consulted a local bank president who helped him seek advice from a financial advisor with North Carolina National Bank in Charlotte on how to resolve the losses. Nevertheless, on the evening of March 6, Walker took his own life with a .22 caliber pistol at the Sharon Cemetery in Mount Gilead, in the plot where his parents were buried. The manner of his death is particularly poignant, considering his father died the same way, also in Mount Gilead. In 1950, B.B. Walker purchased the home of D.B. McCrary, who had passed away in 1946, 2 years after the death of his wife Allie, from McCrary's heirs. Walker and his wife Edna Andrews Walker now owned the house where, as a child living next door, he had visited his wealthy aunt and uncle. Edna Walker and their children continued to live in the house after B.B. Walker's death, and the house remained in the family until it was sold in 2020 following Edna's passing. After that point, no Worth Street properties were owned by the McCrary or Walker families. It is at this point that we can reveal the family tree of the David and Pauline Jarrell Center City Garden, and the 3 interconnected families who played key roles in the property's development into the 20th century. 3 things remain to note. First, with the acquisition of the center of the block, encompassing the McCrary's 3-hole golf course by former Mayor David Jarrell, all or part of the Center City Garden property has been owned by 5 mayors of Asheboro, 6 if you count our current mayor, David Smith, who at one time owned a lot that will be the approach from Cox Street. Second, we are left to wonder how much of a tie the later owners of the properties, John, Elijah, and Emmett Moffett, Samuel Walker, and Allie Walker McCrary, felt to the Worth farm as a result of their connections to Jonathan Worth, through their ancestors' marriages to Elvira Worth? Was it present in their minds? Was it a curiosity that they didn't think much on? Did it motivate their acquisition of the Worth farm lots? Or is it simply a historical coincidence? We know that the McCrarys acknowledged their ties to the Walkers' involvement in the Cedar Falls Manufacturing Company, noting in Acme McCrary advertising a tradition going back to 1836, when the Cedar Falls factory began operation. Finally, development of the Worth farm into the Center City Garden takes on more significance when you consider that ownership of the farm has represented critical eras in Asheboro's economic development. Jonathan Worth, starting out in an agrarian society where practically all labor was provided by enslaved people. Early manufacturing, as represented through the Worths, Walkers, and Moffat's development of the cotton factories along the Deep River. The industrialization of Asheboro, as represented by the later generation of the Moffat family, and the era of modern manufacturing that has been so important to Asheboro's civic and social life in the 20th century, as represented by the McCrarys and B.B. Walker. So it is fitting that the David and Pauline Jarrell Center City Garden will provide time for peace and reflection on this most historical piece of ground.